This week, we'll be talking about sociolinguistics, which is the study of socially conditioned linguistic variation. Last week, we talked about language change of the form A goes to B, which we basically treated as a single categorical event where A becomes B. However, it turns out that this is not exactly what seems to happen. We find instead that the situation is much more complicated. We begin to see some people using B, but not all of the time. And then over time, the amount of B gets larger and larger and larger in the community until eventually there is no more usage of A and only B remains. That intervening time between the first occurrence of B and the last occurrence of A is a period of variation. We represent this variation with A tilde B, and we also call this a variable, where the original A is called the conservative variant of this variable, and the new B is the innovative variant of this variable. While in theory it's possible that who uses which variant under which circumstances is completely random and arbitrary, what we might call free variation, this turns out not to be the case in most situations. What we find instead is that there are statistical tendencies for who uses which variant and under what circumstances they use it, and that the conditioning factors for this are almost entirely sociological: gender, age, ethnicity, class, region, and so on. Because of this, we call the study of this kind of linguistic variation sociolinguistics. It is often the case that one of the two variants in a variable holds prestige. That is, using that variant in your speech is seen as desirable, typically because it is used by people who themselves hold prestige in society. They're rich, male, educated, or otherwise hold some sort of social power. The other variant is then said to be stigmatized because it is associated with low social power. It is undesirable to speak this way. In the most typical case, the conservative variant is the one that carries prestige, and the innovative variant is the one that is stigmatized. But this isn't universal. It is possible for an innovative variant to become prestigious, and for the conservative older variants to be stigmatized. While using stigmatized variants may generally be undesirable in the larger population, it can be useful to use these under certain circumstances where they will carry covert prestige. This is when a group of people with a lower social status speak in a particular way. Speaking in the same way as them is an in-group way of representing that you have solidarity with them, that you are in the same struggle against the established power structure. For example, if you go to a small local neighborhood pub and speak like the locals there, you are more likely to get better service than if you come in speaking a fancier, higher class dialect. Thus, covert prestige essentially inverts what normally counts as prestigious versus stigmatized, but only under special circumstances, when the stigmatized variety is actually more common among the people present and carries a certain level of solidarity. While there is linguistic variation across different social groups, there can also be individual variation at the level of a single person, how they speak under different circumstances, to different people, or to showcase different aspects of their identity. The most basic distinction we make in how an individual speaks under different conditions is register, which is the context in which they are speaking and the mode of their speech, whether they're speaking more formally to someone more respected, or speaking more informally, or to someone less respected. One of the most interesting and amazing things about how this variation works is that we are so adept at switching comfortably from one register to another, talking to whoever we need to in exactly the way that we're supposed to. This subconscious sociolinguistic knowledge carries a lot of facts about different speakers' identities and how it connects to language, and it's not easily taught. And yet, somehow we manage to pick it up. Even as children, we start understanding who we're supposed to talk to in which particular ways, which words and which pronunciations are valid or invalid in a given social circumstance. There are many ways to describe and classify different kinds of variables. Here we will talk about a very basic three-way distinction between indicators, markers, and stereotypes. An indicator is a type of variable that doesn't show variation between registers. That is, speakers don't manipulate it. They either do this or do not, and that's it. An example of this from English is how Canadians generally have the caught merger, so that they pronounce caught and caught the same way as caught, regardless of which register they're speaking in. Another example comes from Mandarin, where the words for star and heart are pronounced the same in Taiwan, but not by other speakers of Mandarin. A sociolinguistic marker is a variable that changes between registers, so that one variant is more strongly associated with high register and another variant is associated with low register. However, there can still be variation here. You might use the low register variant more frequently or less frequently, but still not exclusively. An example of a marker that we'll talk about a little bit later comes from English, and it's R deletion or R vocalization, where R in certain positions is deleted or pronounced more like a vowel in certain dialects of North American English, in particular New York City. An example of a marker in Cantonese is the second person pronoun you, which in Hong Kong is pronounced beginning with the sound la, but for other speakers it begins with the sound n. Finally, a stereotype is a sociolinguistic variable that is so prominent in the awareness of speakers that they know that they do this, and in fact even outsiders are often aware and can mimic it, although imperfectly. An example of this from English is Canadian raising, where the diphthongs I and ow are pronounced with a higher beginning before voiceless consonants, as in ice and out. This feature of Canadian English is so prominent that outsiders notice it and will make fun of it. For example, Americans will often say that Canadians say oot and a boot, even though that isn't technically how they pronounce it. As with most things we've discussed in linguistics, this three-way distinction is not always completely clear-cut. Some indicators may be markers for some speakers or in some communities, and similarly some markers may rise to the level of stereotype. The R deletion or R vocalization marker was notably studied by William Labov in his groundbreaking 1972 study of New York City English. In New York City English, R in certain positions in a word is either deleted or pronounced as something more like a schwa. So for example, the expression fourth floor might be pronounced as fourth floor. This pronunciation is more common with working class speakers in New York City and less common in the upper class, which means that we should expect it to be sensitive to prestige. In particular, Labov believed that whether R is pronounced or not might vary in department stores of different levels of prestige. So he studied its pronunciation in 3 different department stores: S. Klein, which has the lowest prestige, Macy's, which has intermediate prestige, and Saks Fifth Avenue, which has the highest prestige. Labov conducted his experiment by going to workers in these 3 stores and asking questions about the location of certain items that he already knew were on the 4th floor. For example, he might ask, "Where are the towels?" And then he would get the response, "On the 4th floor," which might be pronounced by some workers as "on the 4th floor." He would then follow up by pretending not to have heard or understood them, getting them to repeat what they said. But sometimes the response would be different. They might have said, on the fourth floor the first time, but then when asked to repeat would say, on the fourth floor, more carefully, more emphatically. Labov kept track of whether they pronounced R in the first normal response and whether they pronounced it in the second emphatic response. What he found was interesting in at least two ways. First, there was an overall difference in how often R was pronounced based on the prestige of the store. This is somewhat surprising because the workers in the three stores are actually all from roughly the same social class, so they should speak the same way. It's the customers who are different between stores, not the workers. And yet, Labov found that the workers would speak more prestigiously in the more prestigious store by pronouncing R more frequently. This shows that the workers were able to manipulate this variable in response to their different social situations, trying to match the speech of their customers. Second, Labov found that this variable could be manipulated even further at a smaller level within a given social situation. In the emphatic responses, R was pronounced more often than in the first normal responses, and this effect was seen in all three stores. This study, and many other similar studies since, show that speakers are capable of unconsciously manipulating sociolinguistic variables in a variety of ways for many different purposes. One of the most important social factors that determines sociolinguistic variation is the region in which you're from. North American English in particular has a lot of rich dialectal variation based on region. There are many examples given in your lecture notes, and I'll go through a few of them here. We've already talked about Canadian raising, which, unsurprisingly, is found in Canada, but it's also found in parts of the United States, such as the Upper Midwest, the Eastern Midlands, and Eastern New England. We've also talked about the caught-caught merger, where the words caught and caught are pronounced the same, usually as something like caught. This can be found throughout Canada and the western United States, as well as other parts of the United States, such as the Upper Midwest, the Eastern Midlands, Eastern New England, Florida, and the South. Sociolinguistic variation is not limited to just pronunciation. There can also be differences in the lexicon or the syntax. One of the most notable lexical variables in English is the word for a sweetened carbonated beverage, which can be tonic in Eastern New England, Coke in the South, pop in most of Canada, the Upper Midwest, and parts of the Midlands and the West, and soda most everywhere else. Canadian English is often described as being fairly consistent across the entire country. And though this is somewhat true because it has a relatively more recent expansion of the population in comparison to the United States, so there's less dialectal variation, there is still some noticeable regional variation in Canadian English, and this has become more and more clear as more research has been done. For example, in Canadian raising, the beginning of the diphthongs can be a bit fronter, like in Ontario, or a bit backer in the prairie provinces, something more like and mid-central most everywhere else. And if you're Canadian, you may have gotten into arguments with other Canadians from around the country about what to call a small countryside house that's used for summer weekend vacations away from the city. In Western Canada, it's generally called a cabin, and in most of Eastern Canada, it's called a cottage, except in Quebec, where it's called a chalet, and in New Brunswick and Northern Ontario, where it's called camp. There are lots more other interesting differences in Canadian English described in the lecture notes. Linguistic variation is deeply linked to society, which is incredibly complex. This complexity is thus transferred to language itself, and we can see sociolinguistic variation at every level of a language: its phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, etc. And all of this variation is dependent on a huge range of social factors, situations, and identities. The variation itself is interesting on its own, But the fact that we can even navigate communication with this much variation going on is also fascinating. How do we adapt so easily to having so many differences between speakers? And why does this variation even exist in the first place? It would seem to be detrimental to have such a complex, variable system for communication, and yet, this is how language naturally evolves. It may be the case that sociolinguistic variation is in fact a benefit to efficient communication, because it allows us to transmit a huge amount of social information simply by using a slightly different vowel or a different word. This means we need to carefully consider what it really means to communicate efficiently and why differences between dialects are actually something to be valued and preserved rather than ridiculed and neutralized.